Welcome to The Know. I'm Ashley.
I'm Gus.
This week was Judgment Week for net neutrality in the U.S., and the internet watched live yesterday as the FCC voted to repeal net neutrality measures that were set back in 2015 in a vote of 3-2. You know, after a ton of stuff, ridiculous arguments, lots of grandstanding, a really stupid Harlem Shake video, which has now been pulled off YouTube with a copyright claim because I guess the Harlem Shake guy did give him permission to use it. Oh, and a little tiny little bomb threat that evacuated proceedings for a while.
Yeah, after all that, your internet freedom has been restored. Congratulations.
Except
it's not dramatic at all. Naturally, this is spawning loads of discussions and headlines about what this means, with most of them usually involving something like, is the internet over as we know it?
all caps, lots of exclamation points, that kind of thing.
The frowny face.
Yeah, lots of frowny faces. So it doesn't mean that, not exactly, but it does pave the way for some things that we could see on the horizon, mostly because it's stripping consumers of certain protections that were set a couple of years ago. But fortunately, it doesn't mean the battle for net neutrality is over just yet. It's not decided. There is still stuff to do.
So yeah, I mean, bad news and good news for net neutrality proponents. But let's quickly break down what happened yesterday and some of the arguments we heard for and against net neutrality by the FCC members who voted on these repeals.
Basically, the vote yesterday was the agency getting rid of so-called neutrality regulations that stop ISPs from blocking websites or charging for certain content. Those regulations were set up in 2015 by lumping internet providers into the Telecommunications Act of 1934, which then gave the FCC the same power to regulate them as they would with phone providers or, electricity or any kind of utility.
I think saying phone providers is very key because in the early days, the internet was dial-up over phone lines and then DSL over phone lines, which is how this kind of evolved to where we were.
Yes.
And why we didn't need net neutrality before a certain time.
Right.
The main things they wanted to regulate at the time were that there could be no such thing as an internet fast lane where people paid more for faster access to specific websites. Plus, it disallowed providers from throttling services that took up a lot of their bandwidth, like Netflix, or holding that access for ransom.
Before the vote, each side gave a rundown of their arguments. FCC chairman and former Verizon employee Ajit Pai argued that repealing those classifications and ditching these net neutrality protections will help consumers and give them a wider variety of service options. He said, "We are helping consumers and promoting competition. Broadband providers will have more incentive to build networks, especially to underserved areas."
Which has basically always been the argument for those who oppose net neutrality, but there was some strong dissent by other commissioners, including Minion Clyburn, who said, "I dissent because I am among the millions outraged because the FCC pulls its own teeth, abdicating responsibility to protect the nation's broadband consumers."
Ultimately, the votes were cast. Net neutrality was given a pretty big defeat, 3-2. But let's talk about what all this means now, because there are a lot of scare tactics going around with people acting like this is all of a sudden going to cause your internet prices to skyrocket and you have to pay 17 ounces of blood for every Google search. That's a lot of blood.
A lot of blood, it adds up. What the ruling does mean is that the government can't regulate high-speed internet like a utility, think electricity or water, with neutral access for everyone. So now it's up to individual providers like AT&T and Comcast to decide what to do with the internet, and it's that nebulous gray territory that has people worried.
Yeah, so if the ISPs wanted, they could block certain sites or speed up access to others, like, slowing the products of rivals to a crawl, for instance, because that makes their product seem more attractive. And that might sound like a boogeyman story, but several ISPs have tried before. Comcast, for instance, was notably discovered throttling Netflix to its users back in 2014, before these regulations were put in place. And even earlier this year, Verizon was found to be throttling video streaming services like YouTube and Netflix, but they claimed at the time that didn't violate net neutrality because it was just a test.
Oh yeah, it's
but
cool.
they had to work around the regulations to do anything, even on a temporary basis, is the point of that. That's the difference.
The 2014 case with Netflix also exposed another way this can go. The ISPs can tell a service or website host they have to pay thousands of dollars for their product to be given faster to customers.
Yeah, because that did happen with the 2014 thing, is Netflix actually agreed to pay Comcast for access.
And if you look at the graph of the speed of Netflix access for those Comcast customers,
magically recovered.
You can see the exact moment the check cleared. And at some point, those costs would come back to us, probably in the form of higher subscription costs, different tiers for high-use consumers, both of those, etc. Who knows?
Yeah, there's also the matter of how small startups and future platforms can get their start. If suddenly there's this internet fast lane, I mean, how do we find the next YouTube or Twitch or Amazon if small businesses are having to pay for faster service to consumers? And we might see a lot of these potentially promising new platforms die on the vine because they can't get the data out, and then the user experience sucks and it fails to gain any momentum, and that's it, stagnation.
Basically, all the power is back in the hands of the ISPs, and legally the door is now open to some not-so-great tactics, since we all know that ISPs aren't exactly 100% trustworthy.
Yeah, their priority isn't happy consumers, it's consumers who pay them. Now, it is worth noting that several major telecoms have promised customers they won't throttle access and that their online experience won't change, but again, they now have the power to change that, and if this ruling stays in place, we'll just have to take their word for it. Comcast, for instance, just recently very quietly walked back their commitments to not implement things like content prioritization or fast lanes.
Experts told CBS News that they think some of these changes will start to come eventually, but providers are smart enough to know that they'll be crucified if they're the first to start making them, obviously. In reality, it'll probably be more of a slow burn.
Yeah, others in the industry have commented as well. T-Mobile Chief Operating Officer Mike Sievert said, the major providers out there are smart enough to know not to get between their customers and their TV. We're not worried that we're going to face throttling or prioritization issues.
Fortunately, nothing is over quite yet. There are still things that can happen to reverse this. For one, there are court challenges already on the way. A bunch of state attorney generals are lining up to sue the FCC. New York State Attorney General Eric Schneiderman is leading that charge. In a tweet immediately after the vote, he said, "I will sue to stop the FCC's illegal rollback of net neutrality. New Yorkers and all Americans deserve a free and open internet."
Other states are joining in too, including Washington, Oregon, Illinois, Iowa, Massachusetts. Washington State Attorney General Bob Ferguson said, allowing internet service providers to discriminate based on content undermines a free and open internet. Today's action will seriously harm consumers, innovation, and small businesses.
Oh, and lots of tech companies weren't happy either.
You don't say.
Yeah. Netflix tweeted, "We're disappointed in the decision to gut net neutrality protections that ushered in an unprecedented era of innovation, creativity, and civic engagement. This is the beginning of a longer legal battle. Netflix stands with innovators, large and small, to oppose this misguided FCC order."
In a tweet, appropriately enough, Twitter called it a body blow to innovation and free expression. We will continue our fight to defend the open internet and reverse this misguided decision.
Okay, so I'm sure you're asking yourself, what can you do?
Right. What can one individual do?
It's important to know that this won't happen overnight. ISPs aren't going to start throttling services tomorrow. This will probably end up in the courts, likely as high as the Supreme Court, and ultimately there might have to be legislation to decide what's okay and what isn't. So contact your elected officials and let your voice be heard.
And then hopefully those lawmakers will be sensitive to the fact that, according to polls, 83% of Americans, including 3 out of 4 Republicans, are for net neutrality, and that's actually kind of an important note because the officials who just voted to gut it were put in place by a Republican administration. People who ignore that preference could find themselves voted out of office, and no lawmaker wants that. So again, let your representatives know where you stand.
And despite that comment about the current administration having placeless people, remember, this is not a partisan issue.
No,
this
it's not a partisan issue.
Everyone exactly the same. This shouldn't be broken down to Democrats and Republicans. Meanwhile, could this possibly impact net neutrality in other countries as well? Our neighbors to the north, Canada, are now wondering how this might affect them. For one, there are already efforts underway there to put an end to net neutrality in the name of blocking piracy, though overall, Canada's lawmakers have so far proven to be more steadfast in supporting net neutrality concepts.
It could also mean, though, that services like Netflix end up jacking up prices for everyone, not just customers in the United States. If their costs go up having to pay for speedier bandwidth access, they could spread the load, as it were, across all regions.
Obviously, it's still really early, but this decision could have ripple effects that spread across the globe. We're kind of a major player when it comes to internet here in the United States on account of having so many consumers and online businesses based here.
Yeah, so there will be ripple effects. They may be felt more slowly, more indirectly, but in the end, it'll probably touch everyone eventually. There's also calls for the investigation into the fraudulent comments that have been left with the FCC about net neutrality in the first place. Back in May, they said they were going to leave it up to public discussion, and then the message boards were promptly taken up by millions of fake comments under stolen identities, but that hasn't stopped the FCC from moving ahead, and they still haven't disclosed those public records despite a lawsuit demanding them under a Freedom of Information Act request asking for them. Yeah, legally, they're supposed to respond to those.
They were rather flippant about those comments during the live stream yesterday.
Yeah, they didn't seem to care.
It's also possible that there will be lawsuits from special interest groups and others against the FCC. Over the last couple of years, ISPs have been challenging FCC rulings on net neutrality by kicking it up to federal courts to decide if they had the legal precedent to make the rulings they've been making about net neutrality protections in the first place.
So yeah, still a lot of moving parts. If nothing else, there's always 2020 when we decide on potentially replacing the current administration with a new one. And this is important also, very, very important, local and state elections. Those get overlooked a lot of times. Not as many people turn up to vote, but things can be done at a state level. California, for instance, they're looking at potentially implementing net neutrality regulations for the state if it's not done at a federal level.
So that's the long and short of it. Nothing is over just yet, and you probably shouldn't expect some crazy changes to your internet anytime soon. If you want to help be part of change in these regulations, as always, you should contact your local representative and make your voice heard.
So what do you think of this ruling on net neutrality this week? Let us know in the comments.
And for future updates on the ongoing fight over net neutrality and the future of the internet, be sure to like this video. If you're new around here, subscribe to the know.
Basically, the vote yesterday was the agency getting rid of these so-called
The main things they wanted to regulate at the time were that but there was some strong dissent by other commissioners, including, oh God, I've read it, I haven't had to say it.
Minion.
Minion?
Yeah, I think it was like a flame minion.